Concern is growing over what a second Donald Trump presidency would mean for his adversaries. During an interview with conservative media personality Glenn Beck, Trump sent a warning to his political opponents about what would happen if he is reelected.
You said in 2016, lock her up. And then when you became president, you said, we don't do that in America. That's just not the right thing to do. That's what they're doing. Do you regret not locking her up? And if you're president again, will you lock people up?
Well, I'll give you an example. The answer is you have no choice because they're doing it to us.
Let's bring in Miles Taylor, co-founder and senior advisor of Forward, former Department of Homeland Security chief of staff, and author of the terrific new book, Blowback, A Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump. You're the perfect person to talk about this. I'm curious, first of all, your reaction to this, Miles, and who might Trump target if he gets back in the White House?
Well, you're looking at one of them, Alex, and I only say that half facetiously because I've had a lot of conversations with folks for Blowback and for other things about what Donald Trump would do in a second term. And I think it's very, very clear from those conversations that a second term of Donald Trump would likely be a last term of American democracy because of the intent to go weaponize democracy's guardrails, especially the justice system, against his adversaries. Now, a number of folks who worked in the Trump administration with me and have since spoken out against the ex-president, we joke darkly about the fact that in a second term, a number of us will be in orange jumpsuits in Guantanamo Bay. And I say that the comment is half facetious because Donald Trump actually did have a vision while I was in the administration to go use the terrorist prison at Guantanamo Bay to house political prisoners. And in that case, what he wanted to do is use it to move people from the southern border to send a message and put them in the same place where people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks, sits behind bars and send a message. Now, the only reason Donald Trump didn't start sending people to Gitmo, and this is true, is that he was convinced it would be too expensive and the facility couldn't house the number of people he wanted to send there. Now, that was the mindset of the man when he was president of the United States, and you have seen him since double down on his intention to, again, use the justice system for political purposes and specifically admitting that he would do so to go after his enemies. I think that's very chilling. It's the type of thing that, makes Richard Nixon look like a kindergartner who'd gotten in trouble rather than a criminal, which is what we're seeing with Trump's intentions.
Wow. There's nothing funny about this. It's not a joke, the prospect of him going after you, because you were part of the administration to a degree until things came to light, many of which you talk about in your new book, Blowback. You use stories from your time in the Trump administration. You offer them up as cautionary examples of the dangers of having Trump or someone like Trump leading this country, beyond the prospect of using the Oval Office to seek vengeance. What else concerns you about a second Trump term?
Well, I think this focus, Alex, on weaponizing elections is really concerning. I mean, the elections are one of the few moments in American democracy where everyone has the opportunity to participate. If you poll the average American and ask them about the top attributes of democracy, they're probably not going to cite checks and balances in the justice system, but they're going to cite elections because it's the moment when Americans have that experience with selecting their leaders. And there's been discussion within Trump circles about different ways to hijack the electoral process in the MAGA movement's favor. And specifically, I had one person who worked on Trump's National Security Council tell me about their concern that a second Trump administration would deploy DHS security forces, the security forces that I used to help oversee in the administration, to the polls to try to intimidate voters in future elections. And we saw them attempt bits of this in Arizona during the midterms when you had militia groups go and show up at the polls as ballot watchers to try to intimidate Democratic voters and independents and make sure that they didn't show up and cast a ballot against their side. To imagine the federal government making that a policy and deploying security forces to cities under the guise of election security, but really with an intimidation mission, can only be called authoritarian in nature, Alex.
Yeah. So despite Donald Trump being far and away the front runner to become the Republican nominee, there are new efforts to keep him off the ballot in some primaries. Liberal and conservative lawmakers, keep that in mind, liberal and conservative lawmakers in New Hampshire, Arizona, and Michigan, all exploring the idea of using the 14th Amendment, which disqualifies anyone from holding office if they've engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the U.S. How do you think Republicans in these states would react to this?
Well, actually, Alex, some Republicans are going to be on these lawsuits. So I've had conversations with a number of the conservative legal scholars that are having discussions about these lawsuits. There's organizations in Washington like CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, that have spoken to really the best conservative scholars in the nation about these cases. And I think what will be surprising is you'll see some of these lawsuits brought not by Democrats and Democratic organizations, but brought by Republicans who believe that Donald Trump, under the clear text of the Constitution, is not qualified to run for office again. Now, what can we expect from all of this? There will be a flurry of lawsuits to say he's unqualified for the ballot, and those will get run up to the Supreme Court, hopefully very quickly, so that Americans have clarity on whether Trump is or is not qualified. What concerns me, though, is that if any of these courts rule against Donald Trump, there is, I think, a very real prospect of violence. That's one of those moments where Trump could foment another January 6th type event. And I think law enforcement's watching that very closely. It's a real concern, politics aside.
Yeah, I got to tell you, it's a frightening concern as well. Okay, Miles Taylor, a little shorter than we'd anticipated, but don't feel badly. Everybody's been shortchanged because lots of breaking news today. Thank you, my friend.